The summer of 1965. Vacationing in Europe on a shoestring by overhauling German Panzer tanks. Story and production by Thomas H. Harding. In mid-August of 1964, my father was transferred from Fort Bliss, Texas to Baumholder, Germany to serve as first sergeant of a Nike Hercules battery. This was just another move for the Harding family. Unlike most military families, however, we were quite fortunate to have spent the previous 6+ years at a single duty station without a PCS. PCS is military parlance for permanent change of station. My sophomore year at Texas A&M was still 3 weeks off, so I needed a place to lay my head and was graciously asked to spend the interim with the Stewart family. The Stewarts were previous neighbors in El Paso and were now living in Fort Worth. They had 3 children, and the 2 oldest, Jean was a year older, and Anne a year younger than me. The 3 of us were good friends all through high school. Actually, I always had a crush on Anne, and she even agreed to go out with me on a couple of dates. However, the romance I envisioned never fully materialized. In September, I returned from my second year in the Corps of Cadets, Company G1, as did Gordon Landreth and Jack O'Brien, 2 of my best buddies. Freshmen were assigned to companies based on their chosen major, and the 3 of us were architecture majors. Gordon and Jack would go on to have extremely rewarding careers in architecture, owning their own firms in Corpus Christi and Dallas, respectively. On the other hand, my academic advisor suggested that my true calling had to be in some other field, because it certainly didn't appear to be in design architecture. In those days, I generally chose the path of least resistance, and from all accounts, a liberal arts major was certainly an easier path. Besides, just like my father, I was planning to make the military a career, and rumor had it, any college degree would suffice. As summer of 1965 approached, Jack got wind of a program offered by Lufthansa Airlines. The program, in partnership with the German government, assisted foreign students in finding summer employment in Germany. For each student, the airlines offered a reduced round-trip ticket of $150, which was about half of the going rate in those days. The successful applicant would work for a participating German company for 6 to 8 weeks, and then have much of August available for travel and sightseeing prior to the trip home and back to school. This sounded like a dream come true for we 3 amigos, who quickly submitted applications for jobs within commuting distance of Baumholder. My parents, Kitty and Leonard, graciously agreed to host the 3 additional house guests for the summer. Of course, the more likely scenario went something like this. Kitty said to Leonard, "Honey, don't worry about it. What are the chances those boys will find summer jobs over here?" Well, to all surprise, all 3 of us were accepted for positions with the German defense factory within a 30-minute driving distance of Baumholder. When summer arrived, I flew to Germany on the Army's nickel, since I was an eligible dependent, whereas Gordon and Jack came by way of a more circuitous route. They each flew to London, met up there, and spent a couple of days touring with a friend's father, then to Victoria Station for a train ride to Dover. From Dover, an overnight boat passage across the English Channel to Dunkirk, and then once again by train to Idar-Oberstein in Germany, with a short stopover in Paris. Idar-Oberstein is about 50 miles from Luxembourg, and is nestled on the edge of the Hunsrück mountain range, and for several centuries was known for its gemstones. My father and I picked up Gordon and Jack on Saturday, June 12th, at the Idar-Oberstein train depot, and quickly made our way south to Baumholder, about a 30-minute drive. We boys anxiously awaited Monday morning and the start of our new jobs. The job location was near the small town of Pfeffelbach, about 6 miles due south of Baumholder, or about a 30-minute bus ride, which we took each morning. Each evening, our only way back to Baumholder was to thumb a ride. Looking back, I remained amazed at how accommodating and accepting drivers were of hitchhikers. We seldom spent more than 30 minutes thumbing a ride. Today, can you imagine someone stopping to pick up three strangers on the side of the road? Not likely. From Pfeffelbach, the company provided a shuttle service from the bus stop to the factory, about a 1.5-mile trek. The factory was located near the tiny community of Schwarzerden, not to be confused with a larger town with the same name, about 20 miles north of Baumholder. The factory today is labeled as simply Defense Service Logistics on Google Earth. Upon arrival, we were taken to meet the chief executive of the company. For the life of me, I can't remember his name. His office was in a large corner room on the top floor of a 4-story structure that was just to the rear of the smaller of the two factory buildings. He was a gracious host and greeted us like we were honored guests. He spoke perfect English, which was great because none of us spoke any German, not even a smidgen. He began to explain the purpose of the factory. Essentially, the factory overhauled military vehicles for the German government. Vehicles included trucks, personnel-light carriers, and tracked vehicles to include tanks. That's right, tanks, German Panzers. He briefed us on work hours, expectations, etc. He asked us about our university affiliations and was curious about our hometowns. I told him that since my father was in the military, I moved around a lot, but I sort of called El Paso home. He said he spent some time there, about 20 years before. Before I completed the math in my head, 1965 minus 20 equals 1945, or the last year of World War II, I asked, "What on earth were you doing in El Paso, of all places?" He explained that he was a naval officer during World War II, his ship was sunk, and he was rescued, or perhaps captured was a better word, by an Allied ship and was actually held in El Paso as a prisoner of war. I think I uttered, "Oh my, that probably was not the best of experiences." He said, "It was probably the best result I could have hoped for." He likely had a valid point. I'm glad I didn't respond with, "Small world, huh?" Looking for the conversation to move on to another topic, there was a knock at the door. A middle-aged gentleman wearing dungarees walked in. He introduced himself as Peter. He also spoke English but was not as polished as the boss. Peter was our supervisor for the summer. He walked us through the facility, and everywhere men would momentarily stop working, glance our way. Some would nod in a friendly fashion, and then quickly return to their chores. One of the workers appeared to be taking off old tracks off a Panzer. Another seemed to be working on a wire assembly, standing in a hole where the gun turret would later be installed. Peter explained that vehicles were disassembled in the factory bay. When possible, parts were salvaged and reconditioned, and then reinstalled along with new parts. We exited the first building, and Peter took us to the bottom floor of the larger building next door and told us that this is where we would be working. Stacked there on the cement floor were piles of huge wooden shelves, about 2 inches thick or more, and long beefy metal posts and cross pieces. He showed us a toolbox and supplies, and told us that we would be assembling industrial shelving units, and would likely take us most of the summer to complete. I admit, we were all a little disappointed. All three of us were a bit excited about our prospects of assisting with the overhaul Panzers. However, the large amount of shelving material suggested that Peter was correct. We would be assembling shelves for the duration of the summer. On our second day, the shuttle dropped us off on time, and the three of us immediately went to our assigned workspace. The day before, we organized all parts and pieces and laid out a plan of assembly. We immediately began working. If nothing else, we would be efficient. We bolted the metal risers and struts together to assemble the shelving frame. It took all three of us to lay the first skeleton-like frame onto its side. From here, the massive bottom shelf was aligned with the struts. Pilot holes were drilled, and then the shelf hand-screwed to the frame. Oh, for the want of a modern electric screwdriver. Once the bottom shelf was attached, the frame was flipped upright and the second wooden shelf put in place. We could lay on our backs on each of the previously installed shelves and screw in the bottom of the shelf above. At the end of our first full day of assembly, our wrists and arms ached with strain and overuse. This appeared to be our lot for the remainder of the summer. However, by the end of the first week, we had made a sizable dent in the shelving supplies. Perhaps another week or two, and we would complete this seemingly impossible task. The factory cafeteria was quite satisfactory. The portions were hearty and generally offered an assortment of cold cuts for sandwiches, or you could choose to have a hot meal consisting of meat with 2 vegetables, one of which was always potato. A couple of times a week I had a sandwich which consisted of either bratwurst or a thick sliced bologna on a hard roll. The bread was always fresh and delicious. In the cafeteria we would sometimes socialize with some of the other workers. At first they were curious of where we were from. Once everyone was over the awkward getting to know each other stage, someone encouraged us to sample various beers. On the shuttle we noticed that many workers carried satchels. Later we discovered that the satchels were for transporting beer. The bottles usually had flip tops, which mean they were refillable. In communities with a local brewery, home delivery was an option. Empty cases were placed on the front porch and replenished, much like milk truck deliveries in the U.S. In week 2, the 3 of us made tremendous headway on the shelving units, and by the start of week 3, mission complete. Peter told us we were needed to slow down. Evidently, we were working way too fast. Our next project was a bit of a head-scratcher. Menial job or just an exercise in busy work. We were given nuts, bolts, and other small metal parts to clean with buckets of kerosene and steel brushes. Certainly this could have been done in a large tub with an agitator. Well, the buckets were the tubs, and the 3 of us were the agitators. Our wrists were no longer sore, but by the end of each day, our hands were a red mess. We did not complain, and because of our stoic determination, we were eventually rewarded with much improved jobs starting in week 5. We were all assigned to the Panzer test unit. This was our dream assignment. I think some of our coworkers were aware of our desire and convinced Peter to give us a break. Each of the reassembled Panzers had to be tested on test tracks and then road tested. One test involved a steel ramp the Panzer had to climb in forward and reverse gear. It also had to hold its position without slippage. One of my favorite jobs was to sit in the floor of the tank and hold a strip chart recorder between my legs. The driver would get the Panzer going at a specified speed and then lock the treads. The sudden locking of the tracks, along with the forward momentum, would cause a significant vehicle tilt. The angle of tilt and the time required to stop would be recorded on the chart. Not to make light of the importance of my job, but I could have been replaced by a clamp. Gordon's job was to notify the driver if the engine caught fire. It never did. Gordon's most menial task was to place a rock on the side of each of the rear tracks. The Panzer would move forward about 50 yards and then go in reverse back to the starting position. Gordon would record the lateral distance between the rock and the tracks. If the distance were too great, adjustments were made. In the afternoon, perhaps the most memorable coworker would take us on road test. I think he saw himself as a gallant tank commander, possibly with the famed Panzer Lehr Division of World War II. He wore a floppy hat with goggles, a neck scarf, and other accoutrements. Looking back, he looked more like Snoopy off to fight his nemesis, the sneaky Red Baron. But to us, he was just a fun guy to be around. If after 45 minutes to an hour on the open road, and the tank showed no sign of overheating or other calamity, our Jeep escort would pull off the road and come to a halt. Likewise, the Panzer would follow suit. The entire crew would hop into the Jeep and head to a watering hole. These were good times. Several crew members spoke English, and if not, we communicated with hand gestures and awkward charades. Having a beer with these guys was the highlight of our last week at the factory. At closing time approached, we would hop back in the Jeep, retrieve the tank, and head back to the factory. At the end of week 6, we gathered our last paychecks, said our goodbyes, and packed our bags. Now it was time to literally hit the road and see some amazing sights. Looking back, this was the summer job we would never forget. A book titled Europe on $5 a Day was a bestseller by Arthur Frommer. Each year or so, an updated edition would come out. Each of us had a well-read and dog-eared copy of the latest version. The money earned from our summer job was quite limited, and therefore sticking to a spending limit of $5 a day was a reasonable goal. Gordon and I managed to tour parts of Switzerland and Italy for 3 weeks on less than $150 apiece. Jack, on the other hand, toured for 4 weeks to include a trip to West Berlin on the same amount. He was by far the most efficient vagabond. On our first tour day, my parents drove us to the nearest north-south Autobahn. We received a very last cautionary tale from my mother. We gathered our bags and joined a line of hitchhikers, all hoping for a ride south. That day we made our way to Basel, Switzerland. We found rather cheap accommodations, but blew our daily budget on dinner. The next morning we made our way to Lucerne, a very picturesque Swiss burg that was a tourist hotspot. Gordon and I spent the better part of 3 days in Lucerne taking in the sights. Jack was a bit more anxious to get to Venice, so he started his way south on the second day. Hitching a ride out of Lucerne was frustrating. Gordon and I tried for about 6 hours before we had success. As fate would have it, Gordon carried a maroon bag with Texas A&M inscribed on the outside. A passing motorist noticed the bag and immediately stopped. He was a student at the University of Texas. Say what you will about T-SIPs, a term we Aggies use for students at the other university, but that day one came to our rescue. We took turns driving through the Alps and arrived in Milan, Italy around 9 p.m. We found a wonderful pension for the evening. The proprietor, a jovial sort, was excited to discover that we were all Americans, as he welcomed the opportunity to practice his English. He went to the kitchen and returned with an antipasta tray and poured all 4 of us a small glass of brandy as a welcoming gesture to Italy. This was the start of a beautiful 2-week stay in Italy. The next morning, Gordon and I parted company from our fellow traveler from Texas. We expressed our sincere gratitude for his kindness and good company and wished him Godspeed. This was a weekday morning, and the streets of Milan were congested with commuter traffic. We made our way by foot to a roadway that would lead easterly towards Venice. In less than 30 minutes, we thumbed a ride with a businessman that was likewise headed to Venice. He was a gregarious sort and shared pictures of his wife and children with us. When we arrived later that morning in the outskirts of Venice, he made a phone call and arranged accommodations for us at a Catholic seminary. Being August, the seminary was between semesters, and thus no students in attendance. We found our way by foot to the school. A housekeeper took us upstairs to a large room with about 6 to 8 bunks, neatly arranged on either side. We would later discover that the mattresses were filled with straw, but that never deterred us from falling asleep. I sort of recalled the showers being across the street, but when you're young, nothing seems too inconvenient. The accommodations were modest, and more importantly, so was the fee. Venice is a wonderful city, but it is a little difficult to get a good feel for the lay of the land. However, without the assistance of GPS, cell phones, or social media, we luckily ran into Jack at St. Mark's Square on our first full day in the city. The 3 of us spent the daylight hours fully exploring ancient buildings and structures and the unique canal system. We compared impressions and thoroughly enjoyed this magical city. By nightfall, we searched for an inexpensive meal. Jack was staying at a youth hostel, and Gordon and I headed back to the seminary. A couple of days later, we discovered that the hostel and the seminary were only a couple blocks apart. A couple of days later, Jack checked out of the youth hostel and was headed back towards Germany. He was determined to visit West Berlin. For Gordon and me, our goal was to sample the finest Italian cuisine in Venice, within budget, of course. However, one evening we splurged and took a boat to Lido Island. There we treated ourselves to a seafood dinner that was to die for. I must say, traveling on a shoestring budget is difficult for young men with insatiable appetites. Of course, beside the culinary experience, Venice is for lovers. Gordon made a promise to himself he would bring Linda here after they married. Prior to their 50th wedding anniversary, he kept his promise. As the proverb says, all roads lead to Rome, and the city is a must-see for any traveler. For me, Rome did not disappoint. Prior to the road trip, I purchased my first 35mm camera from the Baumholder Post Exchange. I generally had to put money aside for college expenses, but starting my junior year, I would be under Army ROTC contract. The contract paid a whopping $40 extra per month, so I splurged for the camera and purchased 3 rolls of Kodak Kodachrome film. Along with the prepaid film processing, I was living high on the hog. Many of the photos shown in this presentation were digitized from the original slides made with that camera. In Rome, I was an awestruck tourist. History was alive everywhere we visited. Rome was the seat of centuries of global power, and it was a religious center in the spread of Christianity throughout Western Europe, the Americas, and beyond. Engineering and artistic marvels flourished, and it was home to centuries of civilization growth and progress, and not to mention, hometown to perhaps the greatest cuisine the world has ever known. Besides my camera and film, my only other material expenditure that summer was for a gold St. Christopher's medal purchased at one of the shops in Vatican Square. St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, was a popular saint, and after all, I was a traveler. My first St. Christopher's medal was made of silver. It was given to me by my grandmother Harding in 1952, when my mother and I traveled from Long Beach, California to Hanau, Germany. My father had been stationed there for a year waiting his turn for family housing. I do not recall the actual cost of the gold medal, but I recall it being less than 4,500 lire, around $7. I had the medal blessed by Pope Paul VI. Trying to stay on budget in Rome was difficult. On day 18, Gord and I decided to pull our lira. We were somewhat surprised to find out that between us, we only had the equivalent of about $7.50. For me, my downfall was the discovery of pistachio gelato, and my daily addiction wreaked havoc with my cash supply. We never panicked over our financial woe. We prayed, but we did not panic. Providence shined its light on us many times that summer, and the absence of cash was no problem for the Almighty. For example, when leaving Venice, we hitched a ride with a very kind man who drove us all the way into Rome. He even went out of his way and arranged accommodations for us in a dormitory at the University of Rome. Before setting out each morning, we would check the bulletin board for announcements and possible good deals. For example, earlier in the week, we saw a handwritten note advertising a nearby establishment serving dinner each night for only about 360 lira, about 60 cents. It would possibly remind my parents' generation of a Depression-era soup kitchen. I think we ate there at least twice. On our last morning in Rome, we checked the bulletin board once again. A new announcement caught our eye. A car rental company in Zurich needed a driver or drivers to deliver a car from Rome to Zurich. Gord and I had the forethought to obtain an international driver's license prior to leaving the States. We called the telephone number, and the job was ours. They even provided cash for petrol. We just had to keep receipts. We spent approximately 1 week in Rome, and when our money was nearly exhausted, we made our way to the rental car company and picked up a Ford Cortina. We spent about 2,000 lira purchasing bread and some orange soda. This would have to sustain us for the next couple of days. We drove north along the western coast and visited Pisa and Portofino along the way. Gordon and I are both over 6 feet tall, and sleeping 2 nights in the little car was difficult. I remember waking up in the morning at Pisa and I splurged from our orange soda ration and had a wonderful Italian coffee for breakfast that rejuvenated my spirit. Later that day, we stretched our legs in Portofino and took in the beauty of the Italian northwest coast. The drive through the Alps to Zurich was memorable, even though much of the journey was at night. We delivered the car to the dealership without a scratch, although the manager was a little perturbed that the trip took longer than he expected. According to the instructions we received, we were within the time constraints. Oh well, we were grateful for the free transportation. Out of Zurich, Gord and I hitched several rides. The more memorable one was with a very outgoing and free-spirited Hungarian woman. She told us her story of fleeing communism and leaving family and friends behind. She now made her home in a small Swiss town near the German border. She spoke excellent English. When she discovered that we were Americans and not British, she stopped the car and told us to get our stuff and get out. She apologized, but said she could no longer assist us in good conscience. Unfortunately, she ditched us on a country road in the middle of nowhere. Several hours went by before the next Good Samaritan would assist us. The lady's attitude towards Americans likely resulted from the failure of the United States to provide military support to Hungary during the 1956 revolt. I remember newscasts showing Soviet tanks moving in and squelching the revolt. Thinking back, Gordon and I would have been 11 years of age at the time. Guilty by association, I suppose. Gordon and I arrived back in Baumholder 3 weeks after we first set out. Jack would not arrive for another week. My mother was relieved to have us all back in one piece. Working and vacationing during that memorable summer was only possible because of the kindness of strangers. I'm not sure how many people gave us rides, but the number certainly had to exceed 60. I will always remember the 2 Italian gentlemen that gave us rides and also arranged accommodations for us in Venice and in Rome. Of course, who could forget the pension proprietor that greeted us to Italy, or our fellow Texan who picked up 2 Aggies in Lucerne. Looking back nearly 6 decades ago, the summer of 1965 was a summer to remember.